Thanks, Don. Thanks, everybody. We're sort of on the afternoon shift at 3 o'clock where everybody feels a little bit sleepy, and I'm going to try and make it not worse because, of course, governance is one of those concepts where people's eyes often glaze over. I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Tech Marasini and Dr. Federico Lopez Michaelis, who aren't with me today, but we constitute a team of collaborators who are looking at the governance quality of REDD+ internationally, and particularly in Nepal as a pilot research area. And I want to look and talk to you briefly today about this idea of intentional governance or stakeholder-driven governance, something that is actually both top-down, bottom-up and sideways, a more holistic approach to looking at the structures and processes that underpin REDD+ governance systems, and to make stakeholders and rights holders more central to those systems. So there's another wicked promotion for publications. If you type in Cadman plus governance, you should get those titles. And a lot of what I'm talking about today is based on the research that myself and others have undertaken in the area of global environmental governance and how to render it more effective and legitimate. So I think we all know the basics about why good governance counts. Obviously, poor accountability and transparency measures increase the risk of corruption and thereby encourages illegal and unsustainable logging. Secondly, where key interests are not represented in, particularly in REDD, in forestry decision making, really critical information about local contexts, highly relevant to the sustainable management of resources, can be lost. And you result in a lack of ownership that itself reduces efforts to reduce emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. And of course, if you don't have good monitoring, reporting and verification methods, it's very difficult to tell whether good practices are being implemented, and therefore whether you're actually having a positive impact on the ground. And after all, this is supposed to be a process about impacts on the ground, i.e. less carbon in the atmosphere from trees and peat. So governance, like the word stakeholder or the internet or those kind of buzzwords that have been around for the past 20 years, is something that is on everybody's lips, but it's not necessarily put into effective practice. I would point out, however, that we have seen a number of positive efforts by the intergovernmental community to try and have better structures and processes underpinning the policies that relate to global environmental protection, and particularly in relation to REDD. We have concerns about ensuring transparent and effective national level structures, and we've also had a lot of concerns about making sure that those structures are both consistent and comprehensive. However, one of the problems when you're dealing with such a massive policy community that we're all witnessing here today, and you're looking at quite a complex system in the case of REDD, is you often get contradictions occurring, and you have conflicting norms. A norm is a kind of rule or something that ought to be done. So just a brief look at some of the policy documents. We have different definitions as to what constitutes good governance. And we've also, interestingly, in the language that's used in a lot of REDD texts, we've seen a weakening of some of the language. I'm particularly concerned to see that the 1992 Rio norm, for example, of meaningful participation, which is something very central to good governance, has been somewhat eroded in as a consequence of Cancun. We now see that although we have meaningful participation sort of chapeaued with full and effective, we see that meaningful participation itself has been rendered down to meaningful influence of all relevant rights holders and stakeholders who want to be involved. That's kind of somewhat of a secondary nature of the role that stakeholders should have. Okay, well, so how do we actually determine whether governance is good or not? What I'm presenting here is effectively a benchmark gold standard as to what would represent good governance of any global environmental agreement. It's based on the principles, criteria and indicators model. If you want good governance, you have a series of principles. A principle is a value that you're seeking to achieve. That value itself is broken down into criteria, which are categories that constitute that value, and then each of those categories in turn is made up of a whole series of elements that you would like to see in the field, as it were. And I can't talk in great detail to this, but you'll see that I'm still a great believer in the concept of meaningful participation. And I believe that's broken down into core issues like interest representation and the inclusiveness of interest representation, the equality of the relationships between those who are included, and that those interests actually have the resources or the capacity to participate meaningfully. And of course, another aspect of participating meaningfully in global governance is to make sure that your actions and the actions of those around you are both transparent and accountable. And then the poor relation in global governance is actually the idea that deliberations or discussions within policy frameworks and implementation on the ground are actually productive. You know, they actually result in something. And for that you need good decision making. You need to use that dangerous D word called democracy. You need to have good methods of reaching agreement, and if you can't reach agreement, you need good methods for dispute settlement. And then, of course, once you implement the decisions you've made, well, it's a bit of a no-brainer, but you'd be surprised if that gets overlooked. You actually need to change the behaviour that's led, in this case, to deforestation and forest degradation. You need to actually solve that problem, and you want that problem solution to be durable. Now, from the PC&I approach, you can actually then develop verifiers in the field, and of course this is something that the REDD SES standard is doing. From those verifiers you can create standards, and then of course from those standards you can monitor and verify and ultimately certify good practice. If we look at some of the REDD+ policy documents that have come out over the past few years and we compare them to the famous Arnstein ladder of citizen participation, which came out in the late 60s, we move at the very bottom from manipulation as a form of participation right up through to citizen control. In textual analysis of word occurrence based on that framework that I just explained to you, you will see that the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility and the REDD+ social and environmental standards and various other documents unfortunately tend to fall pretty much around either the informing or the consultation level in Arnstein's ladder. We really should be somewhere in the top third, somewhere around partnership, preferably around delegated power, particularly if you're talking about Indigenous people and minorities on the ground who are going to be most affected, and heaven forbid, citizen power. So with a PC&I approach you can also quantify, and you'll see here that there's a range of perceptions of governance quality between state and non-state stakeholders, but there's general consensus that capacity building in REDD+ is low, that dispute settlement is low, although it is encouraging to see that some stakeholders, if you look at the red circle, feel positively about the degree at least to which they're included in REDD+. So what do you actually do with this kind of thing on the ground? Well, most importantly, you try and get stakeholders to develop standards rather than have standards imposed on them from above, and you encourage active participation and engagement. with a view to creating a benchmark standard against which you can look at the whole plethora of different private governance systems that are out there touting their business in the REDD Plus standards market. At the moment, we just don't have a benchmark. So just to give you an example of what a kind of more collaborative and participatory process for standard setting might look like, we've been working with multi-stakeholders in Nepal over the past 2 years, and standard setting is most effective in the view of myself and my research colleagues and a lot of the stakeholders and rights holders on the ground if it's multi-stakeholder, if it's multi-level and it's multi-stage. So what are the recommendations for COP18? Well, firstly, rather than make or rights holders the subject of governance, it's much better, rather than as in the consultee model, to actually make them drivers of good governance, to give them high levels of ownership. And if you do that, you have an ability to make REDD governance truly participatory. That in turn increases accountability and transparency. It includes all interests in decision making. And also it takes this whole obsession with carbon accounting beyond just the MRV that we heard discussed in previous presentations to actually make MRV a basis for good governance as well. And I have a little slogan there, the MRV of governance and the governance of MRV. And these measures are likely to improve the effectiveness of REDD. Thank you.
And thank you, Tim.